Couple of years, I've gotten myself way more involved. Before that, I actually went to school for chemistry. I work in the food industry. So what was exciting about coming here was so many active and passionate young people that are looking to get involved and making sure that sort of people are more civically engaged. It's sort of, I wish I was doing a program like this when I was your age, so I'm sort of catching up to you all, I feel like. How many of you have heard of Indivisible before? Not many, right? So Indivisible founded about 3 years ago, and the reason it formed was there were some ex-congressional staffers that felt like people had lost touch with their government, right? They felt like people were frustrated, people were angry, but at the end of the day, people weren't actually doing anything in engaging in government. Part of that is because government has made it very hard to engage, which I'm sure you all are discussing. But part of it was also that people had sort of lost that connectivity. And so the Indivisible Guide, which is something they made literally on a Google Doc that became a PDF that they uploaded one night, ended up getting downloaded thousands and thousands and thousands of times, and it sparked this movement called Indivisible.
So just to put a finer point on that, two people who after the election felt like, what can we do? And had been looking at the rise of the Tea Party and their tactics, took it upon themselves to create a Google Doc that they uploaded that led to this movement.
So now you've got 6,000 groups across the state that are doing this work, and the work is all about holding elected officials accountable, which of course you all know, the elected officials work for you, right? And so it's in many ways to think about the Indivisible movement, it's about being the boss of the employees that work for you. How do you hold them accountable? How do you apply pressure, right? And not just sort of erratic pressure, right? How do you advocate for what you want? And so our group is one of the groups in New York that focuses, or is one of the Indivisible groups that are focusing very heavily on state work. And you might ask, well, why the state? It turns out there's a lot of attention on presidential elections and congressional elections, and there should be. There's a ton of really, really important stuff that happens there. But the amount of influence and impact you can have at the state and local level is exponential, right? One, because the people that represent you happen to represent a smaller number of people. So arguably your voice is louder, larger. One, they're more accessible, right? Your state assembly member or your state senator are surprisingly easy to schedule time with. When we first started this work, we would hear if we could get 10, 15 calls into an assembly member's district, it'd shut the office down, right? So if you think about calling your reps as a means of accountability. So we've really sort of grown up as an organization focusing on New York State because no matter sort of what your politics, the state is not in the perfect place. Most people think about New York as a sort of very progressive state if you live from somewhere else. New York City may be, largely proportionate progressive, but the state as a whole has a lot of different politics, has a lot of different needs. And all of those needs are driven by the state budget, right? So the state budget literally decides everything for all of us across the state. What gets spent on, right? What monies are being spent on what needs, on what issues, how much money we're raising, who's paying for that, right? So taxes, right? That's a big part of the state budget. And every year it's an annual process. Nothing is straightforward. So we have an April 1st to March 31st budget. And what that means is in the New York State Legislature, they spend the first 3 months of the year really preparing this critical document. This document that includes, like I said, funding for just about everything that's happening. And so you saw, maybe you've seen news this week where they had to go back to discuss additional funding, for example, the coronavirus in terms of managing that. But generally speaking, that's pretty rare. Generally speaking, April 1st sets the rest of the year, and that gets what's decided. So let's say you want to pass a really important piece of legislation. A good example of this. How many care about climate change in here? Great. The major legislation was passed last year in Albany. We all celebrated. It wasn't perfect, but it was a great step, right? We are going to tackle the climate change issue in New York. We're going to lead on this issue. That legislation needs funding, right? To be successful, you actually need to fund it. And so now they're up in Albany negotiating how much to spend and how little, or how little to spend or where that money should go. And you realize how complicated this is. So one key lesson I want to leave you with from the get-go is as we advocate for things to our electeds, just getting a bill passed is rarely enough. making sure that it actually gets implemented correctly and gets supported after the fact is hugely important. So with that, I'm going to jump into a little bit of the presentation. I want you to note that this presentation was built largely as a tool, as an activist tool. And the reason I say that is because what we're doing right now is, look, I can't pass the budget, I'm not a legislator, but what I can do is get more people to be aware of what's going on and to hold their elected officials accountable. And so what we have, and I'll pass these around, is a toolkit, if you will, right? If you don't mind passing those. These are some of the ways that we are getting information out across the state. And the reason this is so important, if you think about your projects and you think about civic engagement, it's not just the idea you're fighting for, it's how you actually fight for it. And this is not perfect, right? I'm not saying everyone should make bookmarks. What I'm saying is that finding ways to get information out is really, really critical. So note, as you think about this presentation as I'm going through, this is largely a tool that we're using to get the word out. So the quick agenda is I just want to give you an overview of what budget justice actually is, how we're approaching the campaign. I can go into some of the ideas around the legislative package and then mainly how people can get involved. So before